The manuscript was beautiful in all the wrong ways. A forgery, Henri Volkner knew that instantly. The parchment was too pristine, the ink too uniformly faded, but it was exquisite nonetheless. A 15th-century Benedictine psalter, allegedly from Burgundy. A gift from Claude, his mentor. Claude had always delighted in little lies like this, in testing Henri's eye for deception. Henri leaned back in the leather chair that had once belonged to a Swiss defense minister and looked around his office. His kingdom, or what remained of it. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a cold, wet Zurich afternoon. Outside, the Limmat flowed gray and swift beneath a sky like pressed tin. 50 today. He exhaled, rubbed his temples, and turned the manuscript page with a reverent touch. The deception was almost comforting. Better to deal in old lies than face the hollow truth of his own home. The intercom on his desk chirped. A soft buzz, nothing urgent. Marius's voice came through, smooth and familiar. Henri, Madame Elise called earlier. Just a reminder about tonight's dinner. Henri gave a thin smile. I'm sure she did. She also asked if you liked pheasant, Marius added, voice dry. He glanced at the screen. Marius wasn't smiling, but he didn't need to be. The two of them understood each other too well. It wasn't her, Henri said, more to himself than Marius. That was a scheduled text. She hasn't called in weeks. Marius didn't respond. Henri shut off the intercom. He stood, stretched, walked to the liquor cabinet, and poured a splash of Calvados into a heavy glass. The scent reminded him of Normandy, of childhood's never lived. He turned and looked at the painting behind his desk, a Rothko, real of course, red layered over black and violent, bleeding strokes. Once it had symbolized ambition. Now it felt like a wound. His mansion, the one overlooking Lake Zurich, had once felt like a fortress. He had built it for Elise, for the children. Now it felt like a mausoleum. Margot barely visited. Leo stayed in the guest house, brooding over his history thesis and pretending not to be lost. And Elise, well, Henri hadn't touched her hand in months. Maybe years. The phone buzzed. A text, unlisted number. Henri frowned, lifted it slowly. The message was short. They know. It's not what you think. Be vigilant tonight. No signature. No encryption. Just that. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen. Then, deliberately, he set the glass down. Walked to the safe beneath the Rothko, opened it, and retrieved a small black folder marked D13. He had hoped he'd never need it. But hope, Henri reminded himself, was just another lie, and he'd built a life out of recognizing those. He looked out the window again. The Limmat was rising. Tonight, he thought. They'll make their move. He smiled to himself, bitter and sharp. Let them. He'd spent 50 years preparing for betrayal. And no one, not Elise, not even Margot, had any idea just how far back he'd planned his counterattack. The house was lit like a film set, golden and warm, curated down to the last throw pillow. Henri knew the lighting well. Elise had insisted on importing Italian dimmers for the dining room because European evenings should glow, not glare. The Volkner mansion, perched above the lake like some forgotten chateau, looked perfect from the outside. And that was the point. Henri stood for a second at the threshold, breathing in the scent of rosemary and roasted meat. A lesser man might have hoped. He didn't. Elise appeared in the archway, still beautiful in the rigid way of people who organize their expressions like place settings. You're late, she said, brushing a stray hair from her blouse. I'm 50, Henri replied. That earns me a few liberties. She smiled without warmth. Well, the children are waiting. The children. Margot was the first to rise when he entered the dining room, that same diplomatic posture she'd cultivated during her internship at The Hague, like she was perpetually about to deliver a press statement. Her hair was pinned back in a precise bun. Leo slouched beside her, his shirt half-tucked, brows slightly furrowed as if he couldn't decide whether this was a family gathering or a sentencing. Happy birthday, father, Margot said, kissing his cheek with the efficiency of a customs agent. Yeah, Leo muttered, not quite meeting his eyes. Happy birthday. Henri took his seat at the head of the table and scanned the scene. Everything was too careful, the candles perfectly spaced, the wine already breathing, the small smiles like weapons tucked just beneath the surface. He'd walked into boardrooms that felt friendlier. They began with pleasantries. Elise mentioned a new exhibit opening at the Kunsthaus. Margot talked about an upcoming conference in Brussels. Leo commented on the dubious authenticity of a Coptic scroll recently acquired by a London museum. Henri played along, smiled when expected, nodded, but the tension in the room wasn't imagined. It was real, heavy, and choreographed. He noticed the looks, quick glances between Elise and Margot, A slight shift in Leo's jaw when Margot cleared her throat. He wasn't supposed to catch any of it. That was their mistake. Then dessert came, not cake, but blood orange sorbet, of course. Clean, stylish, detached. Elise reached under the table and placed a leather envelope in front of him. Henri stared at it. This isn't a card. No, Elise said, folding her hands in her lap. It's time. He opened the envelope slowly. The papers inside were crisp, freshly notarized. The language was unmistakable. Divorce. Filed. Final. For your review, Elise said, like a broker closing a routine transaction. Henri said nothing. He reached for his wine, took a sip. Margot followed suit, sliding a second envelope across the table. There's been some restructuring, she said. In light of recent inheritance tax loss. Henri opened it. His name was still there, as the former title holder of the Volkner estates. Transfers had already been executed. All properties reassigned. Signatures notarized. Documents registered. You signed these, Margot added. Last quarter, during the review meetings. You remember. Of course he remembered. She presented them under the guise of optimizing the family trust. Legacy security, she'd called it. He trusted her. Leo slid his envelope across the table last. No explanation. Just silence. Henri opened it. A single-page notice. Legal severance of fiduciary rights. Leo had been granted full independence from the European trust Henri had managed for 2 decades. The wording was clinical, but the meaning was clear. Leo had been groomed to replace him. Henri looked at them, Elise, Margot, Leo, and for a moment, said nothing. Then he smiled. Not wide, not warm. Just enough to make Margot blink, to make Elise's jaw tighten, to make Leo shift in his seat. Their coup was complete, and they thought he hadn't seen it coming. Henri folded the 3 envelopes, set them aside, and dabbed his mouth with his napkin. Well, he said softly, I suppose that's dinner. Henri didn't slam the door on his way out of the mansion. He didn't raise his voice or look back once. He walked down the marble steps calmly, hands in the pockets of his tailored coat, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just been disassembled at his own birthday dinner by the 3 people he'd once called family. He got into the waiting car, an old black Audi that Marius had prepped for discretion, and gave a single instruction. Secure line. Marius nodded from the driver's seat, tapped a small switch on the console, and the screen lit up green. Henri pulled out a sleek phone from his inner pocket, unlocked it with his thumb, and called a number labeled only Gregor. It rang once. Directive 13, Henri said when the line picked up. Silence. Then Gregor's voice, rough like gravel. Understood. Initiating phase alpha. The line went dead. Henri leaned back and closed his eyes. He could still see Elise's face when he unfolded the divorce papers. Not relief, satisfaction. And Margot? She hadn't blinked once. Cold, precise. The diplomat. Groomed for betrayal. And Leo? Well, Leo didn't even know what he was doing. Just a pawn with a last name he didn't deserve. They thought they'd pulled it off. That he'd grown soft. Too focused on art collections and dinner menus to notice the rot in his own house. But Henri Volkner had never stopped watching. It started 3 months earlier, with a security alert from the Geneva vault. A minor discrepancy in access logs. One of the biometric pings had shown a 30-second delay before verification. Just enough to raise a flag. He hadn't mentioned it to Elise. Just initiated a routine audit. Quiet. Standard. That's when things unraveled. The access logs revealed Elise's prints at hours she claimed to be in Paris. Then a pattern. Minor financial inconsistencies. Encrypted data transfers from the estate's internal network to an external IP. So Henri called Gregor. They'd met years ago, during an obscure NATO-backed financial intelligence conference in Montenegro. Gregor was old-school Cold War, ex-Stasi with a knack for disappearing trails. Henri never told Elise about him. Never told anyone. Which made him perfect. Covert surveillance was installed across all family devices, phones, laptops, even Leo's old study. Henri paid attention to the details. And what he found made his blood run cold. Emails between Elise and Julian Mertz, a name Henri knew too well. A predator in bespoke suits. Mertz had been sniffing around the Volkner group for years, salivating at the idea of a hostile acquisition. Elise hadn't just entertained him. She was planning with him. Margot, it turned out, was the go-between. She'd introduced Elise and Mertz under the pretext of a legacy preservation advisor. Her real goal was simple. Eliminate Henri's leverage, then hand Mertz the reins. And Leo? The Golden Sun had been busy scanning blueprints of vault systems and uploading financial records, all under the guise of historical analysis for his thesis. Henri hadn't said a word, just planted a few fake files, documents detailing offshore accounts that didn't exist, gold reserves triple their real value, wire trails that looped back to ghost subsidiaries. It was bait. All of it. And tonight, they'd taken it. Henri opened his eyes. The car slowed near the lake. He turned to Marius. Did the Montreux transfer complete? Marius nodded. At 1600 hours, all client accounts from the Zurich branch rerouted to Aegis subholdings. No digital trace. As per protocol. Henri allowed himself a small nod. Then they've already lost. He looked out at the water. Cold. Deep. Reflective. Let them think they've won, he thought. Tomorrow, they'll realize the house they've stolen has no foundation left. Only a fuse. And Henri was the one holding the match. Margot had always known how to talk like she cared. That was her gift, to cloak calculation and charm, to smile while gutting your wallet. When Henri began discussing restructuring his legacy trust, she practically volunteered herself. I'll walk you through it personally, she had offered, laying the documents on the terrace table like a proud intern. It's so complicated with the new EU regulations. You shouldn't have to stress over this. And Henri had let her. That was his mistake. Or so she believed. What Margot didn't realize was that he'd already suspected her motives. That every form she slid under his pen had been printed on specialty paper Henri had altered months ago. Embedded in the fibers were UV-reactive ink marks, security codes, silent signatures that only revealed themselves under a specific scanner Henri kept locked in his Zurich office. To the naked eye, they were standard legal documents. In truth, they were a ledger. Evidence. A breadcrumb trail leading straight to her. Leo had been subtler, if only because he didn't understand the full scope. Under Elise's guidance, he'd been siphoning digital archives from Henri's private holdings for his so-called thesis on monetary influence during post-war reconstruction. But the drives he carried back and forth were rigged. Henri had embedded packet beacon trackers inside the data, ones that would activate once the files were accessed on any unauthorized device. Last week, one of those beacons pinged from Mertz's corporate server in Lucerne. So Leo was in, whether he understood it or not. Henri watched them now from his surveillance feed, sitting in Elise's study, poring over documents they believed were real. Julian Mertz had joined them via video call, voice slick as always. Margot was briefing him on transfer authorizations. Leo nodded as if he understood every word. Elise smiled sharp and smug. Henri zoomed in on the printout Margot held, a map of vault locations and their security cycles. It was a map Henri had created himself, fake, of course, designed to look just plausible enough to be worth something. The security codes listed? They were old Soviet cipher strings Henri had dug up from Cold War archives. Beautiful nonsense. They didn't just steal from him. They tried to bury him in his own foundation. But Henri had been preparing long before they started digging. With Gregor's help, he had traced every movement over the past 6 months, flagged meetings, tracked phone pings, intercepted encrypted emails. Elise had paid off 3 legal aides and 1 notary in Bern. Margot had bribed a compliance officer in Brussels. Leo had used university equipment to skim blueprints of Henri's private holdings and sent them, unwittingly, to a secure server Henri had labeled research storage. They had the whole playbook. And none of it was real. Henri opened a fresh file on his terminal, Project Reflector. At the top was a timestamped log of every action taken by Elise, Margot, and Leo. Below that, a list of contact names, account transfers, shell company links, all admissible, all gathered cleanly. A message from Gregor pinged in. Legal chain is secured. Swiss authorities have been quietly looped. We wait for Mertz's move. Henri smiled. Let them hand-deliver the evidence. Let them bring him the rope they'd used to hang themselves. Family, Henri thought, had always been his weakness. But this time, he'd weaponized it. And they never saw it coming. Julian Mertz stood behind a podium draped in blue silk, flanked by 2 towering LED screens that displayed the Volkner Group's logo, though Henri noted with a grin that the font was subtly wrong. And with the shift in internal control, Mertz was saying, voice calm and predatory, the Volkner Group will undergo a leadership transition to ensure long-term asset protection and strategic alignment with evolving global markets. Henri watched the live stream from the quiet comfort of his Montreux apartment. No tie. No shoes. A half-glass of Armagnac on the side table. Marius sat across from him, typing rapidly into a secure terminal. Has he taken the bait? Henri asked without turning his eyes from the screen. Fully, Marius said. They've announced the acquisition. Publicly. He's citing internal instability and imminent restructuring as justification. And the files. Uploaded to Mertz's servers at 0900 hours. Every line of it is traceable to falsified transfers, illicit offshore stashing, and laundered assets tied to the Lucerne Fund. All rigged to activate with any public disclosure. Henri smirked. And now he stepped directly into it. On screen, Mertz continued droning on about synergy and modernization. Elise stood just behind him, rigid and radiant in a crisp navy suit. Margot hovered to the side, stone-faced. Leo was nowhere in sight. Henri clicked a button and switched to a second feed, a news bulletin from Berlin. Breaking. Swiss financier Julian Mertz under federal investigation. The anchor looked almost giddy with the scoop. Sources confirmed that evidence implicating Mertz in a multi-tier money laundering operation was submitted anonymously this morning to federal regulators in Zurich, Geneva, and the European Central Authority. Early reports suggest ties to diplomatic corruption, illicit trust funneling, and historical financial fraud. Henri took a long sip of Armagnac. There it is. On the screen, the anchor's face turned solemn. And in related news, Margot Volkner, junior ambassador to the EU's Economic Policy Commission, has been suspended pending review of her diplomatic conduct. Leaked communications suggest participation in financial misconduct during her tenure overseeing international portfolio negotiations. Marius lifted an eyebrow. 2 down. Henri didn't blink. Leo. Right on schedule, Marius replied, pulling up a social media feed. A headline from a Cambridge student publication flashed. Local history PhD student expelled amidst accusations of artifact theft and academic fraud. Henri nodded slowly. The manuscript files. Traced back to stolen archival material from the Institute of Ancient Archives. The security codes you embedded matched restricted vault documents. Unmistakable. Henri didn't smile. Not quite. But his face hardened with vindicated calm. They'd never expected the walls to fall this fast. They'd assumed he'd vanish, or protest with lawyers, or beg from the shadows. But Henri hadn't built his empire on sentiment. He'd built it on contingency. On foresight. On the quiet belief that betrayal was not a possibility, it was a deadline. Let Elise feel the floor drop beneath her. Let Margot taste the panic of legacy and flames. Let Leo watch his carefully choreographed future dissolve into a cautionary tale. Has Interpol been briefed? Henri asked. Marius checked a second screen. Briefed. All documentation uploaded. Arrest protocols are drafted. Pending your go. Henri stood, crossed to the window, and looked out over the lake. It shimmered under low clouds, still and silver. Not yet, he said. Let them squirm. Marius paused. Sir. Henri turned slowly. Let them taste what I did. That's slow, sinking dread. One more day. Then we burn it all. He tapped the window glass, once, gently. They wanted the kingdom, he said. But they forgot who wrote the laws. And behind him, the firewalls that had once protected the betrayers continued to collapse, silently and without mercy. The villa in Montenegro sat high on a hill, hidden behind pine trees and carved stone gates. From the balcony, Henri could see the distant shimmer of the Adriatic Sea, blue, endless, and quietly ruthless. It was peaceful here, but not the peace of retirement. The peace of a man who had circled back to where it all began. This place had once belonged to someone named Henrik Voss. Not legally, of course. Not officially. But during the Cold War, when gold moved in unmarked crates and information crossed borders faster than bullets, Henrik Voss had been a ghost in plain sight. A courier. A fixer. A man trusted with secrets too volatile for ledgers. That was Henri's original name. The one buried behind layers of forged documentation, dead-end passports, and encrypted registries. Only 2 people still knew it. One of them was Gregor. You kept the ledger, Gregor said, appearing in the doorway with a weathered folder under his arm. Henri turned from the balcony, took the file. Inside were pages scrawled with aliases, shell companies, and covert financial structures, a spiderweb of identities designed to vanish on command. I never destroy assets, Henri said quietly. Only people. Gregor cracked a rare smile. So what now? Henri walked to the old desk in the corner. He slid the ledger beside an encrypted drive labeled Dante. Then he opened his laptop and scanned the latest updates. Elise was liquidating assets. Rapidly. Everything she touches is booby-trapped, Gregor said, sitting across from him. Every transaction goes through shells we've seeded. She's chasing shadows. She doesn't know yet, Henri replied, fingers hovering over the keyboard. But she will. A new message blinked on screen. Surveillance footage, Elise, pale and frantic, arguing with Margot in a Monaco hotel suite. Henri watched without sound. The body language said it all. Elise pacing. Margot with her arms crossed, shaking her head. Elise pointed. Margot yelled. Elise slapped her. Then Margot left, slamming the door behind her. Henri clicked to the next file. Footage of Leo, alone in an apartment in Berlin. Unshaven. Unwashed. He stared at a tablet, eyes wide with the slow horror of unraveling certainty. No Interpol yet. No handcuffs. Just drift. Henri saw it clearly, the aimlessness of someone who'd bet everything on a future that didn't exist anymore. They're turning on each other, Gregor confirmed. Like you predicted. And Elise. Gregor hesitated. We intercepted a call. She tried to reach Mertz. He didn't answer. She left a message. You promised protection. Henri leaned back, hands steepled. Mertz won't help her now. He's too busy pretending he never knew her. A notification pinged. A forged dossier had been delivered. To Interpol. Henri opened it. Emails, account logs, diplomatic travel histories, all tying Elise and Margot to off-the-record negotiations with foreign diplomats, banking authorities, and estate fund managers with known intelligence ties. Carefully composed. Implausibly tidy. Just enough truth to anchor the lies. Interpol will chase it, Gregor said. You sure you want to play that card? Henri closed the laptop. Yes. For years, he had been a ghost. Playing banker, husband, father, hiding his teeth behind linen suits and softened French. But now the mask was gone. Henrik Voss wasn't just back. He'd never left. And Elise, Margot, Leo, they thought they'd stripped him bare. What they didn't know was that he'd shed the name Henri Volkner the way a viper sheds its skin. I'll authorize the warrants, Gregor said, standing. Henri nodded. And prep fallback assets in Cyprus. Just in case. As Gregor left, Henri poured a drink from a dusty bottle of Rakija. He took one long sip, then whispered to no one. Let the world meet the man they tried to bury. He toasted the room. To Henrik Voss. And the hunt began. The charity gala in Monaco was meant to be discreet. Just a modest gathering of dignitaries and diplomats, a low-key event tucked between louder evenings on the Riviera. Elise arrived draped in pearls and defiance, flanked by Margot in her usual calculated elegance. They walked the red carpet like nothing had changed, like their world hadn't already collapsed. But Henri had planned for this moment down to the second. The ballroom was full of crystal chandeliers and meaningless conversation. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the background. Margot made polite nods. Elise sipped champagne with trembling fingers. She was unraveling inside. Henri could see it on the live stream Gregor had patched through, tiny giveaways. The way Elise kept checking her phone, the way Margot flinched when someone mentioned the European Council. And then, just after the mayor's toast, two plainclothes officers stepped through the side doors. Quiet. Intentional. Unmistakable. Margot noticed first. Her body stiffened. Elise turned toward the entrance as the officers approached. Elise Volkner, one of them said, calm but firm. You are under investigation for conspiracy to commit financial fraud, money laundering, and illegal diplomatic collusion. A quiet gasp rippled across the room. Glasses stilled mid-air. Elise's mouth opened, but no words came out. Margot took a step back as her own name was called. Margot Volkner, you are under arrest for falsification of state documents and complicity in international finance violations. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. Silence had more power. Margot didn't speak as the officers read her rights. Elise tried to say something, to protest, to spin, but it came out choked and incoherent. Her composure shattered before the first cuff clicked. Henri watched it all from his Montenegro villa, arms crossed, unmoved. The feed went dark as the two women were escorted past stunned guests and flashing cameras. Gregor turned from his screen. It's done. Both are in custody. Media is already calling it the Volkner collapse. Henri said nothing. He walked to the window, stared out over the sea. The same sea that had once smuggled documents and gold under Henrik Voss's command now mirrored his stillness. Another ping. This one from a Zurich contact. A clip from a financial news report. Volkner family assets frozen. Investigations expanded to include historic property acquisitions and trust transfers across 4 countries. Henri didn't flinch. Gregor's voice was lower now. Leo's the last. No legal move yet, but... Henri waved a hand. I know. In Berlin, Leo had been slipping through days like a ghost. Surveillance showed him wandering the city aimlessly, staying in a modest apartment with the blinds always closed. He wasn't reading, wasn't writing. He was drinking. A lot. 3 days after the arrest, Henri got the call. Suicide attempt, Gregor said. Leo. Pills. His landlord found him. They got to him in time. Henri sat down slowly. He's being moved to a recovery clinic. Private. Discreet. No press coverage yet. Henri didn't speak for a long time. The betrayal was still there, a deep bruise that hadn't faded, but Leo was different. He wasn't a schemer. He was a boy playing a role someone else had written for him. Gregor stepped closer. Interpol has enough. Elise and Margot will be prosecuted. Mertz is cornered. We can finish this. Henri looked up. His eyes were clear, but colder than ever. Or, he said quietly, we can let them stew. Gregor tilted his head. You want mercy? No, Henri replied. I want them to sit with the ruin. I want them to understand what it means to lose something permanent. And Leo? Henri turned back to the sea. We'll see. The sun dipped behind the waves, and in the distance, the empire Elise tried to steal lay in shambles. Henri had struck. Now he could choose whether to stop. The interrogation room in Geneva wasn't made for comfort. Just a steel table, 2 plastic chairs, and a faint smell of institutional bleach. Elise sat on one side, her posture still proud, but her face hollowed out by days of questioning and nights without sleep. Margot sat beside her, jaw tight, blazer wrinkled, the diplomatic mask long since shattered. Henri stepped in without a word. He didn't wear a suit today, just a dark wool coat and silence. He dropped a slim folder on the table. Elise's eyes flicked toward it but didn't move. Margot stared at it like it was radioactive. Henri took his seat. These are your terms, he said simply. Neither of them spoke. You've lost everything, Henri continued, voice even. Reputation, protection, position. But I'm offering you a controlled descent. A soft landing. Margot leaned forward, just slightly. You mean blackmail? Henri's lips twitched, not quite a smile. I mean mercy. In exchange for complete surrender. He tapped the folder. Sign away all remaining claims to Volkner assets. Publicly renounce any executive or fiduciary rights. Cooperate with authorities. Accept reduced charges through formal plea arrangements I've already arranged. Elise let out a dry laugh, her voice cracked with bitterness. You're enjoying this? No, Henri replied. I'm managing the fallout. You turned a family into a business. Now you can face the numbers. Margot opened the folder. Her fingers trembled. Inside were the documents, legal waivers, property transfers, formal letters of resignation. All prepared. Already. This would end us, she whispered. Henri tilted his head. You ended yourselves. Margot looked at her mother. Elise didn't move. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Elise reached for the pen. Her signature was mechanical. Sharp. Final. When she finished, she closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I'm tired, she said flatly. Henri nodded once. That's the first honest thing you've said in years. Margot hesitated, but only for a second. She signed too. With more force. More anger. As if pressing harder might make the consequences less real. Henri didn't pick up the folder right away. He looked at them both. I should let you burn, he said. But I'm not like you. Elise scoffed. That's what this is? Compassion? No. Precision, Henri replied. You wanted legacy. I'll give you a footnote. He stood to leave, then paused. Leo's alive. Margot's eyes widened. Elise flinched. He's receiving psychiatric care. Not in Berlin anymore. Margot opened her mouth, then closed it again. He'll never see a courtroom, Henri said. Because unlike you two, he might still have a chance at redemption. Elise looked down at her hands, saying nothing. He's being reinstated, Henri added, at a classical arts academy in Florence. Sculpture and antiquities. A field far from finance. Margot blinked. You did that. Henri nodded. This isn't forgiveness. It's containment. He turned to leave, his voice softer now, but cold as ever. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to bury what you became, so no one else has to inherit it. As the door closed behind him, the room felt smaller. Elise sat with her back straight, her fingers clasped together, as if still trying to convince herself that she hadn't just lost everything. Margot stared at the folder, the ink on her name still drying. They had been daughters, wives, architects of betrayal. Now they were just subjects of Henri's final calculus. And the price had finally been set. Zurich looked different now. The same glass towers, the same lake that shimmered with orderly Swiss calm, but Henri no longer saw it as a city of empires. It was a battlefield, and he had walked off it alive. He stood inside the private vault room beneath the new headquarters of Aegis Circles, a leaner, more agile banking consortium born from the ashes of the Volkner Group. The walls were matte black, the air temperature-controlled, silent but never still. This wasn't legacy. This was rebirth. Aegis Circles wasn't open to the public. There were no ads, no press releases, no glossy investor brochures. Entry was by personal invitation only. Every client had been hand-selected by Henri himself. Diplomats who hadn't defected, industrialists who had stayed loyal, families who had honored their word when things got hard. He trusted none of them, of course, but they had earned the right to be watched. A knock at the door. Marius entered quietly, holding a slim silver case. No words. Just a small nod as he set it down on the desk. Henri opened it. Inside was a custom-made chessboard, the final piece recovered from his old estate after the legal forfeitures had cleared. Not one Elise or Margot had ever noticed. But to Henri, it had always been symbolic. The game beneath the empire. He lifted the lid and studied the layout. Black Queen. Removed. White Knight. Removed. All other pieces. Intact. Only the White King remained untouched, positioned at the far corner of the board, exactly where Henri had placed it the night he activated Directive 13. He slid it forward a square, slow and deliberate. Checkmate. On the wall above the desk, a muted television displayed the evening news. Elise and Margot's sentencing had concluded that morning, reduced charges, full cooperation agreements, lifetime bans from financial practice in the EU. The footage showed Margot stepping out of the courthouse in a plain coat, her hair no longer styled to perfection. Elise followed, older somehow, diminished. They walked in silence, reporters shouting behind them, flashes going off like gunfire. Henri turned the television off. Let the public chew on it. He was done with performances. Marius stood across from him now, hands clasped. The accounts are operational, he said. We've completed the recustody transfers. The Phoenix portfolio is officially live. Henri nodded. And the final settlements? Closed as of this morning. No loopholes left. Silence settled in, deep and clean. Gregor sends word from Montenegro, Marius added. He says he's keeping an eye on Leo. The boy's sculpting now. Henri said nothing for a while. Then, quietly, good. He walked to the window. Zurich glowed beneath him, orderly, polished, exact. But Henri wasn't part of it anymore. He existed behind it, between the cracks, just as he always had. His old life was gone. The family name, scorched. The legacy, destroyed by the very hands he once trusted. But Henri didn't mourn it. He had built a new empire. One with no heirs, no weaknesses, no illusions of loyalty. He looked down at the chessboard one last time, then closed the lid. Send word to Cyprus, he said, and inform the Viennese delegation. Aegis Circles is officially open. Marius nodded once, then left the room. Henri stood alone. Sovereign. Damaged, yes, but reborn.